Oh, sorry, I'm a few minutes late. I had some technical issues here. I restarted my computer, and Apple chose to install an update on my machine that I didn't ask for, so that took forever. Hang on, I'm still kind of getting sorted out here. For some reason, the computer's not charging. There we go. Okay. Okay, so not too late, so I think we'll just continue from this point. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, everybody. So this is the last talk in a series on the three characteristics, and today we're going to talk about Anattā, not self, which is, of course, a very central teaching of Buddhism. In fact, I would say it's the characteristic teaching, the definitive teaching, because it's the one teaching that you can really only find in Buddhism. All the other traditions and schools in India are missing that idea. We can approach this in different ways. Let's start by looking at the word Anattā. It means not self. Atta is the Pali equivalent of the Sanskrit Atman. I believe the choice of this word to describe the Buddha's idea was a very deliberate choice on his part, as a counter or refutation to the dominant paradigm in Indian religion at the time, the idea of an Atman. The Atman is the concept of a unchanging, imperishable core to the human being. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually post-Buddhist text, and some scholars feel it was written or composed with an eye to countering or refuting the Buddha's teachings. Seems to be addressing very definitively the idea of Anattā. They're taking a strong stand on Atman, and although the idea of Atman dates back much earlier to the Upanishads at least, but in the Bhagavad Gita, Atman is described as the unchanging, imperishable essence of a person that transmigrates from life to life, and it's compared to a man going to bed at night, and in the morning he wakes up and he puts on a fresh suit of clothes and goes out the door. And that's like being reborn and putting on a new body. In the Upanishads, we also had the idea that that the Atman is Brahman. This is the sometimes called the one mind doctrine. The idea is that Brahman is the supreme principle of the universe, and the Atman is the individual essence of a person. But if it's understood properly according to the Upanishads, there's no difference between the two, that you could say Brahma is the one mind in the universe, and he's looking out through all these windows that are individual beings. So you could say that the Upanishads took the idea of many souls and reduced it to one soul, and the Buddha came along and reduced one to zero. He said there is no essence or unchanging principle in not only in a person but in anything. So that kind of situates the Anattā doctrine in the context of Indian thought at the time. But how can we understand it? What was the Buddha actually getting at? It is a somewhat difficult doctrine to approach because it's a counterintuitive at first. People react to the idea of not self, think that it means that they're unreal somehow. Say, no, I'm real. See, look, here I am. Here's my driver's license. You can see, there's a self. It's identified. But you have to look at it in kind of a bigger picture. So as I said, there's different ways of approaching this. So let's begin with looking at the doctrine of the five khandha, and that's relation to not self. The Buddha analyzed a human organism into five khandha, which means bundles or heaps. So each one is composite. They're not unitary even by themselves. But they're broad categories of existence. That's body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And the purpose of explaining this doctrine is always to point to not self. You see, amongst these five bundles and heaps, you can't find a self. The classical exposition of this is found in the Questions of King Milinda, the Milinda Panya, where the King Milinda asks the monk Nagasena to give a simile or an example to explain the principle of not self. And Nagasena, the monk, he says, "How did you come here today, O king?" He says, "I came in my chariot." He says, "If we were to take this chariot and bust it up into pieces, and there's the axle over there, there's one wheel there, the other wheel there, the seat there, the front board there, the back board there, and so on, where this heap, this pile of parts." He says, "Can you go through these parts and pieces and find me the essence of chariot?" Well, no, there's no such thing. And the dialogue goes back and forth with a bit in a kind of Socratic manner. And finally, the question is asked, well, what then is chariot? What is this thing we name chariot? And the answer is, it's just a name, a designation for this pile of parts and pieces when they're arranged in a proper manner. And so it is with a human being. There's no essence. There's just these body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. And when they're all functioning together, we can call that, by convention, we can call that a person, a human being. But if we take it apart, we can't find anywhere the essence of a person. Another way of looking at this same simile is to say that the idea of a self is a redundant concept. It has no explanatory value. It doesn't add anything to a description of the process. Now, to make this clear, let's update the analogy of Melinda's chariot. Let's say it's 21st century, and Melinda arrived in a Toyota Corolla, and he's proud of it. He's just bought this new car. He thinks it's great. And he tells Nagasena, "I've been trying to figure out how this works, and I believe there's a green goblin that lives under the hood that makes everything go." And his friend Nagasena, who's a classy mechanic, he says, "Oh no, that you're nuts. There's no green goblin." "Well, then explain to me what makes the wheels turn." "Well, that's the axle turns because of the crankshaft that turns the transmission, and that turns the axle." "Okay, well then the green goblin's turning the crankshaft round and round." No, that's driven by the pistons exploding in the cylinder." "Well, the pistons are going up and down because of the green goblin." No, the spark plugs fire and it ignites the gasoline fumes and so on. And you could go through the entire operation of the car, and as long as you don't understand how it works, you fall back on this idea of a green goblin to make it work. But if you examine it in detail enough, you can explain the entire operation of the machine without recourse to a goblin. So it is with a human being. We fall back on the concept of self. We think, I'm moving my arm, I'm thinking, I'm remembering, I'm seeing, I'm hearing. Until we examine closely the various functions, which is really what we're trying to do with Vipassana meditation. You're doing a form of disciplined introspection, and you're observing the phenomena of body and mind, and nowhere do you find a self. It's a redundant concept. It doesn't explain anything. Everything that occurs can be understood without recourse to a self doing it. There's thought, but there's no thinker. There's motion, but there's no mover. There's sight, but there's no seer, and so on. Now, it's a completely redundant concept. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't add anything to the picture. It's only a lazy way of trying to explain things when you haven't examined them properly. The Burmese meditation master Mahasi Sayadaw, in one of his writings, he talks about the realization of this. He says the meditator comes to see that there is only the object and mind rising to the object, and no third besides. The third being a self that's doing it. So that's one way of approaching it, through the five khandha and seeing how everything can be explained without recourse to a self. And when we try and understand it in a more general way, we can bring up the related concept of sunya or sunyata. That is voidness or emptiness. And we could say that anattā is a special case of the general principle of sunya. Sunya says that everything is without essence, is ultimately void. And anattā is applying that general principle to an organism, to a human organism. The idea of sunyata is very profound and very important. And the way of understanding it from a metaphysical description would be to say that things are without substance or essence. Again, we can look at the broader philosophical picture in India, and also this is quite similar to Western philosophy, as, for example, Aristotle, roughly contemporary. The idea generally was held that things in general could be understood as having a substance and qualities. In India, the substance is called svabhava, own essence. So something has any substance, fire, water, air, earth, or more complex substances. They have an essence, and then that can be modified by additional qualities, and the qualities are seen as things like color, odor, so forth, that can change and shift, but the essence remains the same. And this is pretty much the way Aristotle explained matter as well. But in the Buddhist Abhidhamma, the Buddha didn't get into this deep into the metaphysical weeds in his own teaching, but in the Abhidhamma later, the discussions around the nature of things, the svabhava was seen as just a convention. It's not there is actually no intrinsic essence to anything. Things only exist as a collection of shifting qualities, but there's nothing that the qualities adhere to. There's a succinct expression of this that I come across in a Tibetan book that I really like, is that nothing exists from its own side. Things only exist from the outside, looking in on them. Then you think you're looking at something discrete, but or unitary, or real, but from the inside out, there's nothing there. This also ties in with yet another way of looking at it, which is the dependent or interdependent nature of all things. That nothing exists from its own side can also be understood as everything is dependently arisen. There is no self-sustaining, self-existent entity anywhere of any kind, from the smallest atom to large conglomerates like human beings, or even larger like planets, galaxies. There's nothing that exists self-existent on its own. Everything is conditional. It only exists because of interaction of forces outside of itself, which are themselves dependently arisen. So it's a completely looped kind of a matrix, a vector of forces. And we imagine there's something solid and real when it's actually only a momentary intersection of these vectors of force. This kind of a way of understanding the voidness of individual particles or events, dhammas, is, I think, pretty close to modern physics, modern understanding of things. We've gotten away from the idea of particles being solid like billiard balls, to seeing them as probability waves. I think if from a historical point of view, that 19th century physics was probably the furthest distance from Eastern or particularly Buddhist understanding of reality as you could get. And at that point, the Western understanding was completely deterministic, hard material discrete objects. Atoms were like miniature solar systems of hard particles rotating around each other. But then with relativity, and especially with quantum mechanics, this all broke up, and we can no longer rely on understanding things in terms of hard, actually self-existent particles. And a electron is basically smeared or fuzzed out in over a region of space with a probability function that might have a higher probability to arise at point A and a lesser probability at point B and less at C, and so on. And it doesn't become discrete until it's observed. So this is an expression of the relativity of things, the conditionality of things. Things don't exist as discrete entities. So we have this emptiness of self as anattā, and the emptiness of dhammas. When we understand the nature of dhammas, which are the irreducible point instants of reality, that they're in their essence, they don't have an essence. They're void. They only exist as a momentary confluence of forces. We can go one step further and look at sunyata as a general principle of reality rather than looking at discrete entities or particles. Thinking of sunya as a general principle, the sunyata, voidness. And this, I think, is best understood as a potentiality, a universal, infinite potentiality of emptiness. The Tibetans, who love this kind of imagery, compare it to a womb. A womb is the organ in human females and also mammals generally that is essentially an empty space. So a wall surrounding the empty space, but so it's a void, but it has the potential of creating new life. New life can emerge there. So with the sunyata is a void, but because it's void, because it's empty, it has infinite potentiality that anything can manifest. But when something manifests, it loses that infinite potentiality. So any entity, any particle, any being that's in existence is manifest out of the void. And in its essence, it's essentially void, but it's lost that infinite potentiality because it's now like a broken bit. It's limited. Its potential is limited. So this, I think, we could say is the deeper meaning of dukkha. The fundamental reality of things as being broken bits of reality without essence and with a very limited potentiality. So nothing that's manifest, nothing that's existent, can be perfect because it's imperfect just by the very fact of existing. So this ties the sunya in with dukkha. It also ties in with anicca at the level of dhammas, because the dhamma being only a momentary occurrence, this is an expression of its lack of essence. When it just is a momentary confluence of causes that we experience as a event or a particle but it's only exists for a single moment. And because it only exists for a moment, it can't be said to have any substance. Now, one of the, getting back to the special principle of anatta, one of the common questions that always comes up, and I think if I was ever to compile a Buddhist FAQ, this would probably be number one on the list, is how can you teach both emptiness of self, no self, and also rebirth? Isn't that a contradiction? And it only seems like a contradiction because the questioners, excuse me, a little bit of getting over a little bit of a cold. It only seems like a contradiction because the questioner is assuming implicitly some continuity of a self in this life. Are you the same person as you were yesterday? Are you the same person even as you were 10 minutes ago? There's only consciousness arising to objects. And each moment, consciousness is arising to an object. And there's an illusion of continuity in a life because of the association with the body, which of course itself is constantly changing and refreshing, and renewing, and decaying. Well, this is all going on considerable, at a considerable pace all the time. But because of, as we discussed under Anicca, there's an illusion of continuity because of the similarity of moment to moment. But consciousness is arising again and again in this sequence, associated with a body that's also going through its own sequence and relating to the universe through the sense organs. And the only thing that's different at the moment of death, in each moment consciousness falls away and then rises again to seek a new object. And the only thing that's different at the moment of death is that it can no longer do so in association with the body, which is now just an empty shell, a piece of meat. It's no longer functional. But assuming the person is not an arahant, there's still karma and desire, craving, driving the consciousness forward to take an object. And that drive must be acted upon. Consciousness is then has to arise in the next moment, seeking an object. It arises somewhere else, associated with a new body, a new vehicle, and carries on. But there's no continuity of substance. There's nothing that transmigrates or passes from body to body. So the teaching of Anattā and the teaching of rebirth are actually not contradictory when Anattā is properly understood. There doesn't seem to be an issue there. In Milinda Panya, there's a series of evocative metaphors for the process of rebirth to answer the question, is the one who is reborn the same or different? And there's different analogies like passing a flame from one candle to another. The one I found most powerful is the idea of an echo. If you stand and shout at a cliff face and you hear your voice coming back, is that the same or different? So the reborn one is neither the same nor different. It's it's like an echo of the previous life. It's rooted in the causes of the previous life. And this is also goes beyond just rebirth. Moment to moment, your existence is just an echo of the previous moment. And we could also make the point, a very important point about Anattā in relation to the other characteristics, is that Anattā is actually more comprehensive than either of dukkha or anicca. There's a saying in one of the texts, the sabbe sankhara dukkha, sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe dhamma anattā. That's a very succinct and concise but very profound statement. Sabbe means all. So sabbe sankhara, meaning all conditioned things, are dukkha. All conditioned things are anicca, impermanent, but sabbe dhamma, anattā. And now dhamma is more inclusive or comprehensive than sankhara, because dhamma also includes nibbana, or the unconditioned. So whereas dukkha and anicca only apply to samsara, anattā or sunya apply also to nibbana. So sunya is the most comprehensive principle. It's very, understanding anattā to whatever depth you can understand it is also very liberating. Once you begin to grasp that your thoughts are not you, they're not your essence. Your feelings and emotions are not you, they're not your essence. It's very liberating. And really penetrating the nature of anattā leads to fearlessness, because fear comes from fear of loss, of destruction. And if you understand that you have nothing to lose, because there's nothing there to begin with, that burden of fear is removed. Now, it's also true that a person only really penetrates and understands in complete depth the truth of anattā after stream entry. But it can be approached before that. It's like a mathematical asymptote. If you graph an asymptote, it's a mathematical expression, it gets closer and closer to zero, but never reaches it. It becomes infinitely close to zero, but doesn't ever reach that axis. So it is with approaching anattā with the intellect. You can get close, and the closer you get, the less of a leap there is, and it can be a great assistance in the actual attainment of stream entry. And you can approach that 0 point from two directions, which we've touched on both of them, so I won't elaborate too much. But one direction, we could say, is a method of analysis, of looking at the components of body and mind at a finer and finer grain, and not finding anywhere self. The other, we could call the relational method, is seeing the dependent nature of things, to see that nothing exists from its own side, everything is just entirely conditioned. So it's sort of, one is going on a finer and finer grain, and the other is going outwards in a broader and broader matrix, and both of them end up um, dissolving the idea of the self. So I think I've covered that from a few different angles, and I see the chat is quite busy. Let me just scroll it back and see if there's any questions I can deal with. Probably won't get through all of them. Question: is it difficult to ordain as a monk? I say it because Theravada monasteries usually in countries that require visas, and as I see, to get a permanent resident visa is difficult. Yeah, that has become a problem. In my day, it was actually much easier to go to Thailand and stay long term. The international situation has gotten nasty everywhere. If there isn't a monastery in your home country, you're going to have to really research and find out someplace where you can go. If you can get uh, a visa to stay even for 6 months, that would probably be enough for you to get a foot in the door. Monte, can you give advice for dealing with extremely difficult argumentative relatives that cannot be avoided? Yeah, family is is in a way it's a association we don't really have a choice of, but we are karmically linked. You're born into that family because of your past karma, and you have to try and deal with them. I would say the best thing, is to not is to try and avoid bringing anything up that would cause a disputation. If you disagree on politics or religion, especially, don't bring those topics up. Just kind of leave it aside. You don't have to try and prove your point. And if they bring it up, just kind of let it slide. Yeah, okay, just carry on. One of the problems I think with dealing with family too is that because we've been associated with them our whole lives, and then I'm thinking of the case where someone has, is geographically separated from, you're in a different city from their family, but they see them every once in a while. There's a thing you have to try and be conscious of, that your consciousness or will kind of fall back onto old patterns. So try and remain mindful and try to deal with people in the moment as they are now, rather than the whole history. It's kind of hard to do, but you try and do that. Is it useful to ordain as a monk for 2 weeks or something like the Thais do? I don't. I know that in modern times, it's fallen down to that. Some places they ordain for 2 weeks. I don't think that's all that useful. I think because in 2 weeks you're barely learning how to wear the robe. You'd be better off if you got 2 weeks to spend it on a meditation retreat. But there is an old Thai custom that still in rural areas still follows somewhat, is to ordain for an entire rainy season. So that would be like for altogether 4 months, and you stay for the tina afterwards. So I would say, yeah, that is useful. I think for at least for a few months, but I don't see it for a week or two as doing much good. Norma Sky Dower says, "Wie geht's?" Good. Ich bin gut. What is the antidote for restlessness in meditation? Ajahn Brahm says, contentment, but I can't put it in practice because I don't know how. Okay, the restlessness in meditation. Yeah, that is something commonly faced, and the answer is stillness. It's very difficult to do when you're restless. you have to understand that you'll never overcome restlessness by appeasing it. The mind will say, well, I can meditate better after I get up and go for a walk, or I do some chores, or whatever. But don't listen to that. That's Mara. You have to try and be still first physically. Don't fidget. Just try and it can be very difficult when you overcome with restlessness. You really want to move. But if you can push through, break through, and try and still the mind second after the body, you can find real contentment and stillness. But you won't ever get there if you keep giving in to restlessness. You have to go through that suffering of pushing through and being still when you don't want to be. If the characteristic mark of Buddhism is Anattā, and the Buddha, surpassing even arhats, went to its very end, does that imply the Bodhisattva perfected everything except Anattā until his last life? Yeah, that's a difficult question, and I don't think there's a really firm answer to it. I think we have to understand, and I'm expressing kind of my personal interpretation of things, that the path of a bodhisattva becoming a Buddha is different than the path of a ordinary person going through the 4 stages of enlightenment and becoming an arahant. So if you were to apply that 4 stages of enlightenment model, then we'd have to say that the Buddha, even when he was, or the Bodhisattva, even when he was in to see to heaven, waiting to be reborn, he couldn't have been a stream winner even at that point. I think his unfoldment must have been quite different than the ordinary one. And it's said that he perfected all 10 paramis before becoming born as Siddhartha Gautama. That was what the task that he accomplished in his hundreds of lifetimes. And one of the paramis is wisdom. So it's hard to understand how he could have perfect wisdom without understanding Anattā. So I think it's kind of a mystery. We can't really give a definitive answer to that. Question: what I experience quite often in meditation is being impatient and thinking how much the session will last. Is that the restlessness, or what are the hindrances? Yeah, that's restlessness. That's one of the ways restlessness manifests. Try to get away from watching the clock all the time. If you can set a timer and then not look at the clock, that's a good practice. In meditation and at other times, I feel waves of gentle buzzing energy, like from outside, entering the body, staying, visiting for a while, then fading away. That could be piti. You're experiencing a form of piti, so that's good. That you wouldn't be experiencing that if you didn't have some decent samadhi. I wouldn't try and make any kind of esoteric metaphysical explanation for it. Just see it as an energy in the body. How to live in capitalist society as a layman following the precepts. People are very materialistic in capitalist society. Yeah, I think people are very materialistic in general, but probably the capitalist system encourages that more than most. Just try and stay true to your own nature, your own way. You don't have to follow every trend of modern society. Question: I read in Bhagavad Gita that consciousness is a symptom or sign of the soul. When I meditate, I don't notice consciousness arising and ceasing. It's always there. What to do? Well, how do you know consciousness without an object? We only really experience consciousness indirectly because we experience objects, and the objects are constantly changing. At each moment, there's a different object. So consciousness is the principle of being conscious, and may be always present, the potential of being conscious, but at each moment it's arising to a fresh object. Is semen void of conventional self? How does that apply to the Gandhabba seeking rebirth? Yeah, this is another question that has no really definitive answer. This very vexed question of the Gandhabba. I would say that the semen, or more technically say the sperm, doesn't have even a conventional self, nor does the egg. They're components of a being that only and requires actually three components: the semen, the egg, and consciousness seeking rebirth. That's called the Gandhabba in Majjhima Nikaya. And there's a lot of discussion, and people have written academic essays in trying to explain what's meant by the Gandhabba. It's not clear from the text, because the text doesn't really go into detail. It just says at the beginning of life there is the blood of the mother in her season, the seed of the father, and the Gandhabba seeking rebirth. And when these three come together, a new life continuum starts. The commentary specifically rejects that the Gandhabba can be called a kind of a being that enters into the womb. It's like a principle of consciousness arising. But in the Sarvastivada school, it was seen as a kind of a spirit that actually physically traveled from the place of death to the place of conception and entered into the womb at that place. So it's kind of a, I would say, leave it as an open question exactly what the Gandhabba is, because there's different opinions on it, and you can find, if you look around, you can find essays discussing this question in some detail. I get into the discussion of the nature of Gandhabba somewhat in my book on cosmology. That would be one place you can find a discussion of the different points of view. My understanding is not self pertains to condition as well as the unconditioned. Is it possible you could say a little more about not self as it relates to the unconditioned? Well, nibbana is not self because it's also void, it's sunya, and it doesn't have, because it's defined as unconditioned. That's one of the names for nibbana, asankata. So it's not subject to conditionality. It's not subject to dependent origination. So there's no place for a self to lodge in there at all. Okay, I think it seems to be the last question here anyway, so I'll just take this one more question and then I'll check out. Would you say that the foundation of the world is truly ineffable and therefore best characterized as void because it's beyond conception and tangibility entirely, but also permeates all? That's an interesting definition. I don't see anything wrong with it. The foundation, seeking. I think this is another kind of metaphysical concept that different schools talk about. Different schools of thought talk about different foundations of the world, whereas in Buddhism that there ultimately is no foundation. It's all emptiness. It's all turtles all the way down. So emptiness is or voidness is, as you say, ultimately ineffable and beyond conception. We can't really grasp it with our conditioned mind. Okay, so I'll leave you there. I apologize again for being a few minutes late. Blame Apple for that, not me. And I'll see you next week, and we'll be doing something different.